Welcome everybody. We are here today for a new event, So You Think You're Green. We'll focus on the environmental impact of our food consumption. Today I'm here with my colleagues Antonino Marvuglia, Claudia Itai, and Melanie Guiton. So this event is part of the project Science to be Green, which is funded by the Luxembourg Institute of Science and Technology and the Fonds National de la Recherche Luxembourg. So just some practical information. The presentation will last for about an hour, and then we'll have question and answer session. So you can write your question in the question section of the GoToWebinar system on the right. And you're not obliged to wait for the end of the presentation. You can already type your question. So the webinar is recorded. The video and also the slides will be made available in a few days. You will receive an email with the links, and you will also receive a satisfaction survey, and it will be very nice if you can fill this survey so that we can improve the next events. So now I think we can start, and I hope that everybody is here to follow the presentation. So we are researchers working at the Luxembourg Institute of Science and Technology. This is a public research center, and in our team, we are focusing on the quantification and modeling of the environmental impacts of products and services. So we work both with public and private actors, and today we are here to share this knowledge with you. So this presentation has several live polls along the presentation, and the first live poll that we will open now is to know if you already participated to any of the previous events we organized. So we had one event on mobility in November 2020 and one event on housing in January 2021. So maybe you participated to one of these two events, or both of them, or none of them. So this is to know if you already saw some of the content of our presentation or not. So this should be easy to answer. You just need to click. And yes, so when we are ready, I hope you can answer fast to this first question. So we have a lot of newcomers, very nice. So we have also some people that come back, so it's good. I hope that it's because it's interesting, our events are interesting. We can go back to the presentation. And because we have newcomers, it's good that we introduce the concept of carbon footprint that we will mention along this presentation. So here you can see on the horizontal axis the cumulative emissions of carbon dioxide, CO2, since the pre-industrial level, so at the end of the 19th century. And on the vertical axis, you can see the temperature change since this period too. So carbon dioxide is a greenhouse gas, and it can keep the warmth on Earth to make it livable for humans. But since the first industrial revolution, we emit a lot of CO2 emissions, so about 2,200 gigatons of CO2, which translate into a global warming of about 1.4 degrees. And we can already feel the consequence of this climate change because we have more extreme weather events, or the coastline is also changing. But if we continue like this, by the end of the century, we could reach a global warming of more than 4 degrees. And this will have dramatic consequences on human lives, because maybe some region will become not livable anymore due to extreme temperature. There will be some islands that will disappear, and so on. So we need to reduce the CO2 emission to limit the global warming, and each degree we save, it's also millions of lives that are at stake. If we do extreme efforts, we could mitigate the global warming to 2 degrees, and it's in fact the target set during the Paris Agreement in 2015 to stay well below 2 degrees of global warming. It means that we cannot overpass a certain amount of CO2 emissions, around 800 to 1,000 gigatons of CO2, this is what we called our carbon budget to stay within 2 degrees of global warming. So now, how this CO2 is emitted? It's mainly due to the combustion of the trio of fossil fuels, which are oil, natural gas, and coal. There are also some minor emissions due to chemical reaction, for example, for the production of cement, and also deforestation, because when we are cutting trees, we release the stored carbon. But it's not only the CO2 is not the only greenhouse. There are also fluorinated gas that you have in your fridge or your air conditioner. You have also dinitrogen oxide, N2O, and methane, CH4, that are both emitted mostly in agricultural activities. We'll see that later. All of these greenhouse gases have different power to trap the heat in the atmosphere. For example, for a period of 100 years, the methane will trap 25 times more heat than carbon dioxide. So based on this, we express the impact on climate change based on kilogram of CO2 equivalent. So this unit will be used for the rest of the presentation. Now, we are not really burning coal in our house or cutting trees ourselves, but this is used to, for example, produce electricity that is further used to run industrial machines, or the oil is transformed into fuels for our cars, or we cut trees to have space to grow crops. And in the end, all of this is necessary to satisfy some human needs in terms of mobility, warmth, and food, for example. So when we do the exercise of carbon footprint, what we do is to quantify all the greenhouse gas emissions that are emitted along the processes that are required to provide a certain function. So now we will open a new live call to test a bit your knowledge. And it will be about the Luxembourgish carbon footprint. So now I spoke mainly about the global greenhouse gas emissions, but how much do you think food contributes to the carbon footprint of an average Luxembourg resident? Is it 7%, 17%, 27%, or 37%? So of course, this is for Luxembourg carbon footprint. For other countries, you can have other percentages, but here we are looking at the Luxembourg carbon footprint. And if you don't know, just make a guess. We will give you the right answer just after. Okay. I hope you can all give your answer. And now, okay, so the majority thinks it's 27%. And now let's see, let's go back to the presentation to see the correct answer. So again, this is for Luxembourg, and for Luxembourg, it's 17%. If we build now the carbon footprint of a Luxembourg resident, we have first the transport sector, because we use quite a lot cars and also planes. Then we have the housing, because of the high amount of energy we consume in our house. Then the use of consumption goods, so our clothes, the detergent, and so on. And then the food, with about 2.5 tons of CO2 equivalent per year. And finally, the public services, because hospitals, police, public construction, and so on also emit carbon greenhouse gases. And we have an allocation of these greenhouse gases to ourselves, because we use also these public services. So if we sum all of this, we reach a carbon footprint of about 14.5 tons of CO2 equivalent per year. While if we want to reach the Paris Agreement target, we should only emit 2 tons of CO2 equivalent per year by 2050. So it's quite a challenge to reach that target. And today we'll try to see at least how to reduce our food carbon footprint. So after this short introduction on carbon footprint, we will discuss about the impacts of agriculture activities, then the environmental impacts of different consumer choices, and finally we tackle the issue of food waste. And now I will leave the floor to Claudia to speak about the agricultural impacts.
Thank you, Ellery. So I wanted to start by giving you an overview of where greenhouse gases are coming when you're talking about the food supply chain. So as you can see, the vast majority, about 67%, occur in the agricultural stage of production. But we also have emissions in the processing of food items. Let me see if I can move the slide. Yes, so it's about 11% when it comes to processing, also refrigerated storage. Then for logistics, 8%, this is mainly transportation, so also transportation to these processing centers, to regional distribution centers. Finally, packaging, it's about 6% of greenhouse gas emissions. This includes both the manufacturing but also the disposal of the packaging. And then we come to the use phase. So this includes you basically taking your car and going shopping for food, refrigeration at home, and the energy used to cook the food. And then the end of life stage. So this includes the disposal of food waste at home, but also the waste that comes out of the human body, so the wastewater treatment. The agricultural sector emissions consist of different, next slide. So we have enteric fermentation emissions, land transformation, soil management emissions, manure management, and then fossil fuel use in agriculture. And you can see that here's where these emissions, the methane emissions and dinitrogen oxide emissions occur that Ellery had talked about. So agriculture is actually a big contributor to non-CO2 greenhouse gases. And in this part of the presentation, I'll be focusing on this sector in particular. So on this next slide, you can see an overview of where these emissions come from. So direct energy use in agriculture is, would mean, for example, the diesel that is used to power the tractor, or the electricity and natural gas that is used to power the irrigation, the water pumps for irrigation. Holy smokes. Sorry, there's a big delay between when I hit the button and the next slide comes. Then we have indirect energy use. So this is the energy that is embodied in the inputs that are used in agricultural production. And these are mainly fertilizers and pesticides that are quite energy intensive to produce. Then we have these soil management emissions that contribute to carbon dioxide and dinitrogen oxide. And these relate mainly to how you till the field. And then we have the emissions that come from the livestock sector. So manure management causes methane and dinitrogen oxide emissions, and it depends heavily on how the manure is stored and treated. And then we have enteric fermentation emissions that are methane emissions that come mainly from ruminant livestock that have two stomachs, and also this bacteria that help digest the food but also produce methane. So contrary to popular belief, the majority of these methane emissions come out of the front end of the cow and not out of the rear end. All right, so I'm on this next slide, I'm focusing mainly on energy use through these different stages of food production. And you'll see that on the left, or on the right, we have the food products that are livestock products. And you can see that still it's sort of similar. The livestock products have a bigger energy use footprint than the other food products. But when we move on to greenhouse gas emissions, which is on the next slide, you'll see that the livestock products have a much bigger greenhouse gas footprint than the other food products because of these emissions that I just talked about. So enteric fermentation, manure management, these are these direct emissions from livestock that then show up here and that are not related to fossil fuel combustion in food production. Okay, so on this slide, I'm showing you the results from a study by Poor and Nemeczek. It's a really great study if you have the chance to read it. Basically, it summarizes the information from many, many other studies. And so what you see on the left here, that for wheat farms, the contribution of each source to farm stage greenhouse gas emissions, the majority occur here, so in fertilizer and pesticide manufacturing. We also have quite a bit direct energy use in agriculture, so electricity and fuel consumption by tractors, irrigation pumps. Then also emissions related to the application of fertilizer to the field, and then quite a bit of emissions related to crop drying. So on the right panel, you see some examples of where these emissions come from in different systems across the world. So if we're talking about conventional wheat production in agriculture, the majority here are from application of synthetic fertilizer. In Cyprus, for example, with irrigated wheat production, as expected, we see a big share related to electricity and fuel consumption to run those irrigation pumps. Then in Germany, when it comes to organic wheat production, we have quite a bit related to crop drying. So as you can see, while we can draw a kind of general conclusion, it really does depend on the exact type of cropping system that you're talking about. Right, so on this next slide, I wanted to introduce the topic of pesticide use. When we're talking about pesticides, there's really three main categories: fungicides, herbicides, and insecticides. And on the right here, you can see pesticide use in Luxembourg over the past couple of years. Not that much has changed, but we can see a general trend away from herbicides and into fungicides. Another point I wanted to make is that historically, pesticides have been mainly applied directly to the field, as you see in this image here on the bottom left. But that since the late 2000s, so for the past 10-15 years, we've seen really a dramatic increase in pesticides applied directly to the seed. As you can see, these are soybeans, and on the left, you can see the blue coating that has been applied to the seeds. These are pesticides that are treated differently in terms of how they are regulated, and also it leads to, we basically know a lot more about field-applied pesticides than we do about seed treatment pesticides. There's actually an article that a summary I wrote on science.lu where you can read up on it. So because the way our surveys have been conducted in the past, we don't know that much about seed treatment pesticides, and also farmers themselves don't always know what is on their seeds. So there's a risk that this could lead to overuse of pesticides. A theme that I'll pick up again is that we see there's actually a trade-off between herbicides and getting rid of weeds using tillage. So this is a trade-off. Of course, the main concern with pesticide use is the impact on off-target organisms, whether these be other animals or humans. In Luxembourg, Luxembourg banned glyphosate at the beginning of this year, so you can no longer apply glyphosate. You might know glyphosate under its trade name Roundup. And Germany is banning glyphosate in 2024. This is really recent news that they will do the same. The EU as a whole banned the use of neonicotinoids in 2018 out of concerns for the impacts of neonicotinoids on pollinators. Neonicotinoids are a pretty powerful insecticide. Another story I wanted to tell was around pesticide use and genetically modified organisms. So in the US, for example, if you have a herbicide tolerant variant of corn, this would be called Roundup Ready corn, you could apply glyphosate even after the corn has emerged in the field, and you would get rid of all of the other weeds, but the herbicide tolerant corn would remain. One of the other concerns with pesticide use is, of course, managing pesticide resistance, which requires coordination across farmers in a region. One of the solutions is integrated pest management and also precision agriculture. So using new technologies to try to limit pesticide use to those parts of the field that really need it. On this next slide, I'm showing you, we're discussing fertilizers. When we're looking at the carbon footprint of diets in the EU as a whole, it accounts for about 17%. So it's quite an impact, mainly because synthetic nitrogen fertilizer is so energy intensive to produce. One of the trade-offs with fertilizer use is discussed here on the right panel. So if you have a cropping system of monoculture, so for example, continuous corn rotation, you always plant corn, then you end up requiring more nitrogen fertilizer that leads to more dinitrogen oxide emissions than if you have a diverse cropping system. So a crop rotation with a diverse mixture allows you to use less nitrogen fertilizer and can actually reduce N2O emissions by 30 to 40%. So here I'm talking about soil management emissions. On the left, you can see conventional tillage. So this is just a regular plow that really plows up the whole field, so turns the soil completely in order to get rid of weeds. In the middle picture, you see reduced tillage. So you can see this kind of beige strip between the green plants. This beige strip is really the dried crop residues from the previous season. And what it means is that really only these green strips were actually tilled or plowed, but the remaining soil was undisturbed. And in no tillage systems, you can see these crop residues really lying across the entire field. And what is happening is that the seed is actually injected directly into the soil in order to not really disturb any of the other soil. And one of the trade-offs I had already mentioned is that in the no tillage system, you end up using much more herbicides in order to get rid of the weeds. But you also require less diesel to power the tractors. On the right side, you see the results from a very recent study in 2020 looking at maize production in Poland. And you can see that overall, actually, the carbon footprint is quite similar across these three different tillage systems, and that the majority of emissions come from fertilizer. But when you have this no tillage system where you keep the soil undisturbed, soil health is much improved and you are actually able to sequester a lot more carbon. So what happens is that the net carbon footprint in the no tillage system is 60% lower than in conventional tillage systems. So no-till systems really allow us to reduce soil management emissions, but we need to use more herbicide. So one of my concerns right now, now that Luxembourg has banned glyphosate, is that we might see a return to more tillage and we would see greater soil management emissions in Luxembourg. Okay, so here I'm going to show you a series of CO2 concentration maps. As you may not know that the concentration of CO2 in the atmosphere actually varies over the course of a year. So here we are in mid-March. Here's the United States, here's Europe. In the United States, at least, which has quite a bit of electricity consumption related to the use of air conditioning, because it's quite hot. In the spring, we do not yet use air conditioning. We don't need that much heat. And here you can see how much CO2 concentration we have. Fast forward to just a couple weeks later in early April, and you see that the CO2 concentration is much higher. And this is basically the result of tillage starting and the release of CO2 of nitrous oxide into the atmosphere. So the concentration of dinitrogen oxide and CO2 released from the soil both increase. We can actually see it on these satellite images. And then when we move to the summer, we actually have crops growing and of course sequestering the CO2. So to me, it was actually quite powerful to see that you can actually see this on satellite images. And if you have the chance to look at a documentary on Netflix, it's called Kiss the Ground, and I really recommend it as a way to learn more about emissions from the agriculture sector. So on this next slide, I'm moving on to emissions from livestock. As I mentioned before, we have the methane emissions related to enteric fermentation, and we have the methane and nitrous oxide emissions related to manure. But we also have the soil management emissions that come from pasture management and also crop production. So they are embodied in the feed that the livestock eat. And then we have, of course, the CO2 emissions from operating farm machinery and heating buildings, etc. So on this next slide, I'm showing you on the right side, I'm comparing here ruminant livestock to non-ruminants. And for ruminants, you have actually, and these bars are the 10th and 90th percentile in terms of contribution to greenhouse gas emissions. So you can see the majority actually come from enteric fermentation, but you also have emissions from crop production and pasture. But for non-ruminants, you do not have pasture and you have a much higher share of emissions for crop production. So here, the last bit of information is relates to manure management emissions. These depend on how the livestock are housed, how the manure is then collected, how it is stored, and then also applied to pasture. But some livestock operations actually take the manure and treat it in these, you may have heard, methane digesters, so anaerobic digestion, in order to capture the methane and produce biogas. So on this next slide, I'm showing you how this works. You have the manure from livestock, but you can also use the just organic waste, even produced from households. You take it, you mix it, you ferment it, and you capture the methane that comes off, purify it, and use it as biogas. And this is, of course, beneficial because when you burn biogas, you produce CO2, which is a much less potent greenhouse gas than if the methane goes directly into the atmosphere. So with anaerobic digestion, you produce biogas, but also you're left over with still some manure solids that you can apply as fertilizer. So on this next slide, I'm showing you a study for the US on dairy manure management. This is greenhouse gas emissions here. This is the 0 line. And for different sizes of operations, so we have small dairy farms with under 100 cows, large 200 to 1,000, and then so-called permitted facilities for those with more than 1,000 cows. And really, this is something you really only encounter in the US, these huge facilities. When you have a small dairy farm, the emissions are generally lower because the farm is able to handle the manure as a solid and basically apply it almost daily to the fields. So you don't have any emissions from storage, which is in contrast to these larger dairy operations with quite a bit of emissions from storage. And then finally, you have the super large, where you can install these anaerobic digestion systems and actually have negative emissions here. Now, I should tell you that in Luxembourg, actually, you can find anaerobic digestion systems even in smaller dairy farms. So if you have such a system, you're really able to reduce emissions related to manure management. So I think it's time for another live poll. Between 2001 and 2015, Oil palm and soy replaced respectively 11 and 8 million hectares of forest. What about cattle? How many millions of hectares did it replace? Of forest did it replace? 5 million, 15 million, 25 million, or 45 million over this whole period? I admit that I did not know the answer to this myself. Okay, I think we can see the results. At least if I hope if enough people have voted. And just as a reminder, in the meantime, you can always type in your questions into the chat, which we'll get to at the end. All right, so quite a bit of heterogeneity in terms of how much we think, how much forest was replaced. The answer will be given by my colleague. So if we can get back to the
So the majority of you actually gave the right answer, because a study from the World Resource Institute showed that actually between 2001 and 2015, 45.1 million hectares of forest have been substituted to create a cattle pasture. So this is a staggering number. Here, if you can see the picture that should the map that should appear right now. Do you see it? Not yet. Yeah. This has occurred. Basically, this is a very huge area. It's an area of the size of Sweden approximately, and this has occurred mostly in South America, as we can see. So this is something that gives us a clear message that you have to start doing something to decrease this trend or to stop deforestation at all. But when it comes to livestock production, so how can we decrease the greenhouse gases emissions from livestock? Basically, there are several benefits from agricultural practices that we have learned about, we will talk in a while about organic agriculture. There is the possibility to use a different feed composition in order to decrease the amount of enteric fermentation and therefore reduce the emissions. And there is the possibility, of course, to use confinement, so not to allow the cows to graze outside, but to keep them in the stables. And this, of course, reduces the amount of deforestation that would occur, because less pasture area is needed. But those practices vary a lot. But for sure, there is then a clear message we can see and we can give from around the world, that is that improving pasture management can reduce the greenhouse gases emission between 10 and 50%, mainly thanks to the decreased soil carbon losses that come then with the lower deforestation. And to make this point a bit more clear, we found these different studies, and we show here one study from Italy, which compares extensive and intensive cattle management systems. And we can see two things in this study. Here we show in the figure the emission, the CO2 equivalent emissions per kilogram of live weight of the cow. One thing we can see is certainly that intensive management has lower emissions than extensive one. So when the cows are confined, but of course, it also we can also immediately see that the rate of emission that is due to the feed production is higher in the intensive system, because of course in this case feed is the main origin for food intake for the animals. And this has also then, of course, implications for not only for the CO2 emissions, but also, for example, for the water use, so the use of water that is needed to irrigate the feed. So, as in most of the cases when we do the analysis of the environmental impacts of different production systems, there is always a trade-off, let's say, to take into account. Then, if you in the next slide, wait for the next slide to come. Yeah, we can see that, of course, we as consumers have the choice, the possibility to choose between different food ingredients because they come with different impacts. In this slide, we show impacts on two different categories. So we show on the left-hand side the kilogram of CO2 equivalent emitted per 100 grams of protein of the food. So it's not per kilo of food, but related to the protein content of the food. And on the right-hand side, we see the impacts related to the water consumed for the production of the food, expressed in kiloliters of water weighted scarcity, which is the indicator we use in this case. So we can have two clear messages from this slide. One is that there are certain food items which generate lower emissions in terms, for example, of CO2, like for example nuts, but can have very high emissions on the other hand in terms of water needed to produce them. Of course, then we have always to reason in terms of the quantity of food which is eaten. Of course, we don't need eat in terms of kilograms as much nuts as we eat, for example, meat or other food items. But this is a message that we have to take into account. And the second thing is the big variability that we can see. And this comes from different studies because, of course, there is never a neat number that we can give as emission in any of the categories. But there is a range of variability, which is shown here with the width of the bars that you see in the graph. But we can also see another third important thing, that there are some food items, and we probably all know these, like the red meat, which are linked to very high emissions in terms of CO2 compared to the other food items. And we can see this better in the next slide, where we compare the food items only for what concerns their CO2 equivalent emissions. And we can see, if we look at in particular the last row, and we compare poultry meat with red meat, we can see that the emissions are roughly 10 times lower for white meat. So one thing to take into account when we make our dietary choices is if we want to reduce the global CO2 emissions, to shift more toward white meat rather than red meat. But then let's say we started to talk about consumer choices. We'll talk more about this in this next section of the presentation. What can we do then to improve the impacts reduce the impacts that we have on the environment due to the food that we consume? And would like to ask you, what have you done recently to reduce, or in the last year, let's say, to reduce your food environmental footprint? Did you buy more organic food? Did you buy more local or seasonal food? Did you use more reusable packaging? Or did you reduce your meat consumption? Or you tried to minimize your food waste? Or you did more of the above at the same time? So we'll give you some time to vote. Yep.
Okay, let's see the results.
Okay, so the vast majority of you try to reduce the meat consumption. So already it goes in the right direction based on what we have seen in the previous slides. But there is also a very important percentage of people who really try to reduce and minimize the food waste. So we will deal with this in the last part of the presentation. And this is a very important action that we can do to reduce our emissions related to the food consumption. So we go back to the presentation now. And we will deal, just a second, maybe the slide to appear. Yeah. We'll deal with an important point, which is on our daily choice of possibility of choices, which is the use of organic food. So As we know, organic food is a practice which has certain principles and is based on certain practices like crop rotation, non-use of genetically modified organisms, improves biodiversity and bans the use of chemical pesticides and synthetic fertilizers. But contrary to maybe to a diffused belief, the use of non-synthetic pesticides and fertilizers is allowed. So the regulation says that they can pesticides and fertilizers of natural source, meaning animal or microbial or mineral or plant source, are allowed unless there is not a sufficient amount of products of this origin or sufficient quality that can be used to produce this organic food. So non-synthetic pesticides and fertilizers are allowed. Here you can see the logo of the used in EU, across EU, to guarantee the organic origin of your food. But in Luxembourg, you have some other additional labels that you can find that guarantees that additional criteria have been applied on top of the ones which are imposed by EU in order for you to be allowed to put the organic logo on the food packaging. One is using on top of that the biodynamic principles. The other one guarantees you that the products are national origin also, and the last one guarantees the use of biodynamic principles and also fair prices. In terms of the share of organic farming in Luxembourg, we have 4.4% of the farms in Luxembourg which are organic farms versus the 7.5% average at European level. And we have seen, especially in the last years, a big increase in the demand of organic food in Luxembourg. 80% of organic food, therefore, has to be imported. And this increasing trend in the demand for organic food is not only a peculiarity of Luxembourg. In many different countries in Europe, this has been observed, especially in France and Germany. Then we can ask ourselves, what are the impacts of organic farming? Is organic farming always better than conventional farming? So the answer is not clear in every respect, in every possible impact that farming activities generate. And in order to show you this, we show here this graph that plots the ratio between the impacts generated by the organic farming for a range of products, food products, over the impact generated for the same products by the conventional farming. So all the points which lie above the one line mean that for those food items, organic products have larger impacts than conventional products. And vice versa, so the ones that are below the one line mean that for those food items, organic farming is better. Organic products are better because they have smaller impacts. We show here only impacts on two categories, which are greenhouse gas emissions and land use. Because for other categories, the studies are not so numerous and the results are also not so clear. What we can see is, in terms of greenhouse gas emissions, that there is no clear superiority of the organic products versus the conventional ones. If you read the numbers, you will see that on average there is only maybe 4% of the cases, the impacts of the organic food are only 4% lower than the ones of conventional food. So this is not significant. It's not a significant number. While for the land use, we can see that for sure the organic food produces higher impacts, and this is normal because the yields for organic food are much lower, are between 10% and 60% lower than for the same food produced in the conventional manner. Therefore, they need more land to be produced. Then, for sure, there is one category which is the impact on toxicity, both human and terrestrial ecotoxicity. So impacts in terms of toxicity on human and on ecosystems, in which, for sure, the organic products are better than the conventional ones. Here we show this study among a few that can be found, and they are not so numerous, also showing impacts on those categories. This study regards leek production in Belgium, and the study shows that for human toxicity, organic leek is produces 4 times lower impacts than conventional one, and for terrestrial ecotoxicity, it's even 196 times lower impacts than for the conventional one. The impacts are expressed in the dichlorobenzene, which is equivalent per kilogram of product, which is the reference substance that we use for this to characterize this type of emission. And then finally, there are also for sure some positive impacts that organic agriculture has over conventional one. There is a better soil quality property which is maintained, and then also there are positive impacts on ecosystem services or in the provision of habitat for pollinator or for native pests and disease control agents. So these are positive impacts that they have compared to the organic to the conventional agriculture. They can be found in some publications. They are discussed in some publications, but the way to quantify them is less easy than for other kind of impacts. Then let's say there is the item of what other consumer choices can we do to reduce our impacts, and so I will pass the floor to my colleague Ellery, who will guide you more on these further aspects.
Yes, so let's talk about local food consumption. So if we speak about national food, it's quite a challenge in Luxembourg because we depend highly on imports of food. The only food category for which we are less dependent is meat products, with about 62% of the consumption of meat which is satisfied by the local production. As we have seen in the beginning with Claudia, the transport represents about 8% of the greenhouse gas emission along the food supply chain for the European consumption. So this is quite a small number, let's say, but this share of transport impact can vary depending on the food product. So here we can see that the gray bar, which represents the transport impact, can be about 5% of the total carbon footprint for pig meat, but up to 43% for the bananas production. So it's more relevant to decrease the transport impact for food products which have a high share of transport impacts, which is mostly the case for vegetables and fruits in particular. While for animal products, the transport impacts are quite low, so it's a bit less relevant to focus on transport impact. But also what we can see in this example is that the carbon footprint of bananas, which has a significant transport impact, is still much lower than the one of pig meat. So it's not really relevant to compare the impact of food products based on their transport impact. Now, how the food transport impacts are distributed. For that, I'm showing you the example of a study in France. We see here that the national traffic for food transport represents only 20% of the food traffic, but 50% of the greenhouse gases. So it's the light gray bar. Why? Because this national traffic, and also at the European level, is mostly done by trucks, which is one of the worst transport modes after the plane. And it emits about 40 times more greenhouse gases than container ships that are used to import food from America or Africa, for example. Another outcome of this study is that one food product which has a significant transport impact is also animal feed, because we import quite a lot of feed from international countries like Latin America. So even if you are eating a local animal product, you can still have a significant transport impact because the feed has been imported from a long distance. Now, what about the impacts of consuming local food? So unfortunately, we cannot give a clear answer to the environmental benefits of this consumer practice, because it depends a lot on the agricultural practices and the climatic conditions. So the farmers next to you can have better agricultural practices than the one further to you, but it can be also the contrary. Here I'm showing you the example of the consumption of lettuce in UK. So they show that with open field farming, the consumption of salad produced in UK is slightly better than importing salad from Spain, but still there are some uncertainties, so it's not really significant. But if this salad is produced in a heated greenhouse, then the impacts are much worse than importing from Spain. We'll see that later with the seasonal products. Another possibility is to apply what we call short circuit. So for example, to buy directly from the farm. And to do so, you will probably use your car because it's in a remote area. And we have this study from the consumption of apples in France. And they show that you really need to limit the distance between your house and the farm if you want to stay beneficial compared to the long food supply chain. So on the left side, if you're not buying only apples in this farm, and for example, if the farm is at 20 kilometers, you need to buy at least 11 kilograms of apples to stay beneficial. On the right graph, if you only go to buy apples, then you need to buy more than 30 kilograms of apples. So it's quite a lot of apples. So the conclusion is that we need to be careful not to shift the transport impact from the trucks in the long food supply chains to your car as a consumer. So if you want to go to the farm, prefer not to use a car, but if you are obliged to take the car, it should be very close to your house and you need to buy the maximum of food products from this farm to stay beneficial. Now we will speak about seasonal food, and in fact there are several seasons in the world. So you can say that, for example, the strawberry season in Luxembourg is in June, July, but it's much earlier in Spain. So when you are buying off-season product regionally, it might be that you are importing globally seasonal products. So for example, here it's another case study in UK for the consumption of raspberry, and they found that the consumption of raspberry in May, imported from Spain, for which is a season at this period, is slightly better than the consumption of raspberry in July, so produced in the season for UK. But the difference is very small, again, like for the salad case study. So it's the same issue that with the local food, we cannot really be sure that it's better or not because we have a lot of variety of impacts based on the different agricultural practices and climatic conditions. The other possibility is that the farmer will heat a greenhouse to produce, for example, summer food products into autumn or winter, etc. And this is a very bad environmental practice because you will use a lot of energy to produce these fruit products in a heated greenhouse. So you can see the example of tomatoes produced off-season in a heated greenhouse in France. So the same conclusion that for the heated greenhouse in UK, it's very bad compared to other practices in seasonal products. And there are only a few exceptions to this, is for example in Iceland where the heating is produced with geothermal energy. But in general, we should avoid this. And you cannot really know if your product has been produced in a heated greenhouse or not. It's not labeled on it. So to avoid this risk, it's preferable to avoid off-season consumption. So now we'll speak about packaging. At the beginning, Claudia showed that packaging impact represents 6% of the carbon footprint of European food consumption. And before we try to reduce the impact of packaging, we need to remember that the main function of packaging is to preserve and protect food. There are, of course, other functions related to marketing, information, and so on, but this is the first function. And the impacts of producing food are always higher than the impacts of packaging. So this ratio is always above 1. You can see this ratio for different food products here. It means that it's always better to invest a bit into packaging to avoid food losses along the supply chain, but also at the consumer level, rather than trying to avoid packaging and then generating food losses. So can we reduce still this packaging impact? There are some packaging-free supermarkets like Uni in Luxembourg, and we found one study that compares such packaging-free supermarkets with conventional ones in Germany, and they analyzed only 6 products. But for 4 of them, they found a significant reduction of greenhouse gas emissions, about 30%. But it was not the case for fruit bears because you need to use a reusable packaging that you will need to clean each time because it's very dirty to buy fruit bears. And the cleaning impacts are higher than producing a single-use packaging. The same for tofu, which will be packaged into a glass packaging, which requires a lot of energy for its production and transport, and these impacts are higher than the production of the thin plastic film you usually have on tofu. So there are several studies that compare reusable versus single-use packaging, and most of them will show an environmental benefit. But we need to be aware that the impacts of producing a reusable packaging are always higher than the ones of producing a single-use. It means that you need to use your reusable packaging a certain number of times so that the impacts of this reusable packaging become lower than the single-use one. And here I'm showing some break-even points for different reusable beverage cups compared to the use of single-use paper cup. And we can see that for a plastic reusable cup, you need to at least use 20 times this cup to be better than the paper cup. And for a ceramic cup, you need to at least use it for 350 times. So you cannot break your cup before using this amount of time. So to conclude this, reusable packaging seems a very good option, but we need to increase the reuse numbers and also minimize the cleaning impacts to be sure that we keep an environmental benefit. And while I'm speaking about that, I'm sure that you are thinking about this poor turtle with the plastic packaging around, and why I'm saying that some plastic packaging are so good, like this reusable plastic cup or the tofu plastic film. In fact, we do not have yet data and models to really quantify the plastic pollution associated to the use of plastic packaging, and then also to quantify the impacts on the ecosystem or on our human health. But there are a lot of research ongoing on these topics, and we hope that in a few years, maybe we could show you indicators related to this plastic pollution. So now the last option is to adapt our diet. So in Europe, this is the diet in terms of mass and in terms of greenhouse gas emissions. So we clearly see that meat, which represents only 13% of the mass in our diet, represents more than 50% of our carbon footprint. So we need to reduce this meat consumption, but not only for to reduce our carbon footprint, but also from a nutritional perspective, because, for example, in Luxembourg, we have a consumption of about 246 grams of meat per day, just above the European average, while national recommendations based on nutritional aspects say that we should have a maximum 100 grams of meat per day, and some countries recommend even a lower consumption. So what are the benefits we obtain with adapting our diet? So if we follow the nutritional recommendation, we can decrease by 10 to 20% our carbon footprint. Here I'm showing the example of German recommendation, either with 64 grams of meat or 40 grams of meat per day. But for other countries, you will find the same benefits. And if you go a bit more extreme, if you go vegetarian or vegan, then you have a higher reduction of your carbon footprint by 30 to 50%. You can see here the value for Germany and USA. They are a bit similar. There are some difference, of course, but this is the same range. The good thing is that you will have other benefits on other environmental indicators and also on your human health, because we are eating too much fat and we have problems linked to the meat consumption. But there are some trade-offs. Potentially, some studies show that vegetarian and vegan diet could increase the impacts on water scarcity, notably due to the consumption of nuts. And from a nutritional perspective, there is a potential lack of vitamin B12. And now I will let Melanie end with the food waste issue.
Thank you, Eloy. Yes, so let's talk about food waste. First, it induces to differentiate avoidable and non-avoidable food waste. So the avoidable fraction corresponds to food that could be eaten, but which is lost or which become unfit for human consumptions due to bad management at the production, retail, or consumer stage. So for instance, it can be edible crops that are left in the field, vegetables that are damaged due to bad transportation conditions. And it also corresponds to the surplus food which is produced but which is not sold in retails or shops. And it also corresponds to the surplus food which is prepared by the households, which are finally left over because it goes beyond the nutritional needs. And the non-avoidable food waste fraction, it corresponds to food that cannot be eaten by humans because it's naturally inedible. So it corresponds to meat bones, shells, vegetable peels, and so on. And it also corresponds to food processing waste residue like tea or coffee leaves, and so on. So the waste hierarchy that you can see on the right, it has been set by the European Commission a few years ago, and it provides a guide to choose the most environmentally efficient treatment for food waste. So many countries in Europe are multiplying the incentives to reduce avoidable and edible waste fraction through education of consumers and through better organization for the redistribution of the remaining part towards people through food banks, for instance. Regarding the avoidable but non-edible food fraction, it's redirected towards animal feeding if it's compliant with the related safety and hygiene norms. And it can also be redirected towards industrial use for the production of various bio-based products, since some molecules of high added value can still be extracted from organic waste. The remaining part of edible and non-edible food waste that cannot be valorized are recommended for composting and biogas production. I will come back to food waste treatment after, but let's see more details on the environmental impacts induced by food waste. So first, to start, I have a question. So if we can go to the live poll. So what do you think about the global amount of food which is wasted worldwide each year? Does it correspond to 10% of the total food which is produced, 25%, 33%, or 50%? So take time to think of it and make a vote, and then we will discuss more in details the results. Okay, so maybe we can see the results of the vote now. Yeah, and most of you have the correct answer, indeed. If we come back to the presentation. Claudia, maybe you can switch to your screen, your full screen. Yeah, perfect. So the correct answer is indeed 33%. 1/3 of the food produced worldwide is wasted, which corresponds to 430 million tons of waste each year. And to give you a more concrete idea of the wastage extent, it has been calculated that avoidable food waste generated in Australia for 1 year could fulfill the needs of more than 900,000 people. So it means more or less 1.3 times the population in Luxembourg, so it's really huge. And wasting food means that we waste some resources for its productions, land, water, energy, fertilizers, pesticides, and so on. So producing food that will not be consumed lead to loss of economic value. It has been estimated that the cumulated cost of food waste is 143 billion euros annually worldwide. But it's also important to notice that the food waste leads to unnecessary greenhouse gas emissions accumulated over the food supply chain. And it corresponds to 8% of the greenhouse gas emissions that are released each year worldwide by all sectors combined. And according to the United Nations Food and Agriculture Organization, if food waste were its own country, it would be the 3rd largest greenhouse gas emitter, right after China and the US total greenhouse gas emissions from all sectors combined. So as mentioned, the food is wasted all along the whole the food supply chain, from the initial agricultural production down to the final household consumption. And food is significantly wasted at the consumption stage, as you can see on the red bar on the graph. Some losses also occurs early in the food supply chain, but it's in a lower extent, as you can see on the graph. So if we look at the greenhouse gas emissions of food waste accumulated over the food supply chain, it represents 15% of the entire food supply chain carbon footprint, and it corresponds to more or less 2 kilograms of CO2 equivalent, which are emitted per kilogram of waste. And looking at the contribution of each of the 5 main stages along the supply chain, you can see that the primary agricultural production of food is the main responsible for food waste cumulative carbon footprint. So the treatment and elimination of waste generated at the consumption stage contribute only to 4 to 6% of the food waste carbon footprint. So it means that waste generated by the consumer are impactful due to their production that could be avoided if we reduce the amount of waste generated by the consumer. In order to go a bit deeper with this trend, let's have a deeper look at the waste composition generated in Europe and in Luxembourg. So Luxembourg amount of food waste is 118 kilograms per capita per year. So it's in the average, the European average. And 75% of it are induced by households. So if we look at the graph, we can see that between 55 and 60% of waste are made of fruits and vegetables, of cereals, including bread and bakery waste, and of dairy products. Meat, it represents less than 10% in the average European food waste composition. And for Luxembourg, it's a bit more, it's around 14%. But it's so there is quite a low contribution in mass from meat, but waste from meat are the first contributor to food waste cumulated greenhouse gas. So you can see it on the blue bar on the graph. And as my colleague Claudia explained at the beginning of the presentation, meat production induces large amounts of greenhouse gas from soil and manure management, livestock enteric fermentation, and crops production to feed the livestock. So wasting meat induces a high amount of greenhouse gas emitted unnecessarily. And if we go now to have a look at the food waste treatment, so once they are generated, they must be treated. Even if it contributes only to 4 to 6% of the food waste carbon footprint, each food has some considerable variations of impact that are also depending on the specific efficiency of the technologies that are used and the installations that are in place. And each food also provides some advantage. So in Europe and in Luxembourg, there are 4 main routes for food waste treatment. Based on numbers from a study from Mondello and based on the Luxembourg Plan National pour la Gestion des Déchets, the major part of food waste are composted. So composting and anaerobic digestion at the industrial scale, it necessitates some infrastructures, but these technologies emit the lowest amount of greenhouse gas in comparison with incineration and landfill. And as a counterpart, the production of biogas can substitute fossil resources in the production of electricity and heat. And the compost can substitute mineral fertilizers, so it means that we don't need to produce them, and we also avoid the associated release of greenhouse gases. Then regarding incineration, it can also provide heat recovery in substitution of fossil resources, but the infrastructure is not systematically equipped for that. And the incineration process itself is most impacting than the anaerobic digestion or the composting. And regarding the landfill, it's the last beneficial option. From what we mentioned, we can say that I would like the slide to go on, but okay. We can say that reducing waste through a better management of our consumption is the best option to improve the carbon footprint associated with food waste. European and national incentives work in this sense through the objective of the Sustainable Development Goal for targeting which targets a 50% reduction of food waste per capita by 2030. In Luxembourg, it was estimated that 40% of the food waste could be avoided. So there are many initiatives in this sense, and also to reach the objective of the Sustainable Development Goals. so there are some initiatives for waste reduction at source. For instance, there was recently a zero waste strategy that was implemented, and many communication actions around it. And regarding waste treatment, Luxembourg would like also to increase the share of bio-waste valorized to produce some renewable energy in order to reach 25% of renewable sources in the national energy mix by 2030. So now it's time to go to the conclusion of this presentation. If we want to have the main message discussed along it, so the most powerful actions to reduce the environmental impacts associated to our food consumptions would be to revise our diets in order to limit our meat and dairy products consumptions. As we saw, their production contribute largely to the carbon footprint of food. Then choosing organic food can be beneficial for the environment, not necessarily for the reduction of the carbon footprint, but the associated agricultural practices can contribute to lower some other impacts on human health and biodiversity. Taking care about packaging will be also beneficial, and finally reducing food waste or better valorize them will slightly contribute to reduce the global food supply chain carbon footprint. But there are some other benefits, such as fulfilling the nutritional needs of all population and the substitution of fossil resources, for instance. So I would like to thank you for your attention, and we will be happy to answer your question. Thank you.
So thank you. We'll go now to the question section. So sorry, we are a bit late, and sorry for the technical issue. I will start with the first question that was asked by Joy Mengen. Why do fertilizers and pesticides need so much energy to be produced? And maybe Claudia, since you presented this slide, you can give some inputs.
Yes, so I think actually fertilizers really require the most energy, and nitrogen fertilizers, they actually use natural gas as a feedstock. So you need the natural gas to convert it into the nitrogen fertilizer. So it uses natural gas, it's very energy intensive, and the same applies for pesticides. But if you look at the greenhouse gas footprint as a whole, then the majority is indeed for fertilizer production rather than pesticide production.
Yes. There is now a question from Lucy Mascarenas. Are low emissions vehicles being used in agriculture in Luxembourg and Europe to reduce the carbon footprint of food production? So you mean the tractors, I guess, so it really on the farm, not for the transport of food, I guess. Some of you has some information about that on?
I think it's quite low use.
Yes.
And I can, one other thing I can say is that Luxembourg has a lot of livestock production. And then there are, of course, larger farms that focus on crop production, and they have, for the most part, in these past 10, 20 years, moved away from tillage. And now that we have the glyphosate ban, I've heard stories that they actually have to buy a tractor to do tillage again. So basically, we're almost moving in the wrong direction here, I think. But someone else wanted to say something in terms of the low emission tractors. Antonino, or?
No. I was referring to the fact that yes, it's a low use of these solar, for example, powered devices. There have been also, let's say, different ways to arrange the crop in the field so that the passage can be reduced. The number of passages can be reduced. So not in the source, but in the number of passages that you have to do with the device. And it's not only the tractors, but also not only the tractors for the plowing, but also the tractors that spread the pesticides on the field. these also, and so there have been, for example, some proposals, some solutions using UV, certain UV panels, let's say, that catch the crop in between, and then they kill the pathogens using UVs instead of using pesticides. But the problem is that always there are also trade-offs, because the UV lamps also, they have to be produced, so there are certain emissions that are related to the production and to the end of life.
Okay, so there is the next question from Frédéric Conrad. What do you think of the potential of seaweeds to reduce beef methane emissions? So I think, Antonino, you.
Yeah, I can answer that. I mean, there is this other possibilities, yes, that have been advanced, and there are already quite a few studies on this. There is an algae which is called Asparagopsis taxiformis, which is used, which can be used to as an addition to the feed in certain percentages. So it's dried and then added to the feed. It's a red algae. And some studies prove that it can reduce between 80 and 99% the emission of methane. The problem is that there are two maybe problems. One is the upscaling of the production of these algae, because they have to be produced in the coastal areas, and of course you can also try to devise a way that they can be produced in containers with salty water, but the productivity will be lower. And then there is the fact that there are concerns about although there is no adversarial effect that has been proven on either on the health of the cow or on the quality of the milk produced, there are still some reluctances, let's say, I mean among farmers to use this, because you know, there is no, it's like with vaccines, there is not a certain certainty that they really don't produce any adverse effect. And finally, there are some concerns about the iodine content in this algae that has to be taken monitorized, because if it exceeds then the iodine content, a certain dry matter intake that is allowed you know, for the health of the cows, then the cows can really have problems. So let's say potentially, from what the studies show, this could be a very good solution, but there is some reluctance related to the possible adversarial effects. And there is a company which is called, I think, Bioma zero emission cows or something similar, that they have proposed a solution that to upscale this to the industrial level and then to sell it to add as an additive to the feed.
Okay, so we don't really know. We hope that it could work, but we are not really sure, let's say. So the next question, again from Frédéric Conrad: how much food is produced locally versus imported from foreign countries to Luxembourg? So in fact, we don't have, I will take the answer and then you can complete if you want, my colleagues. But I don't think we have the full balance with the import, production and imports. But we have, for example, the balance between the consumption and the production for different food products in terms of mass. And we have shown, for example, that for fruits and vegetables, it's very low. So we have a local production that represents 1% in the case of the fruit and 5% of our consumption in the case of the vegetables. For the meat, we have a higher proportion of local production. And for beef, we even produce more than we consume. So we export beef meat. But the total balance in terms of mass, we do not really have it, I think. And for example, but I'm quite sure it's, let's say, maybe around 2/3 of imports. I think for the organic food, for example, it's 80% of imports. So we have an increasing demand of organic food in Luxembourg, and we need to really import more organic food to satisfy the consumption. I don't know if you have more precise data, but yes, this is the partial data I can give you, Frédéric. We don't have the full balance with weights and so on. Okay, so if you don't have, I can go to the next question. Lucia Garzaron asked, what is the reason for the increase in the use of fungicides? So Claudia, I think you showed this in Luxembourg, that herbicides were slowly decreasing, but the use of fungicides was increasing.
I am not really sure, but I think that also the reduction in herbicides and insecticides is really removing the regulatory or basically you're no longer allowed to apply certain insecticides and herbicides. So this is why they have gone down. As for why fungicides have gone up, I'm not really certain. Antonino, do you know? Or
no, to be honest, not on this.
Yeah, and there was a peak. It was a bit strange also, but yeah, sorry, we cannot give you further details on this. But maybe this is not a question, it's a comment from Monique Faber-Decker. Glyphosate is not the only herbicide which can be used, but it was the cheapest. So there will still be herbicides used in the future. Yes, so I don't know if, again, Claudia, or you want to...
Yeah, that is certainly true. So, but we have had conversations with local actors in our local farmers, and we think that glyphosate will be replaced mainly with increased tillage because glyphosate was a broad spectrum herbicide, so it really attacked many different weeds. And so if it's replaced, it will not be replaced by one herbicide, but by several others in combination.
Yeah, exactly. So at the end, it will cost much more, let's say, to have.
Now there are 3 questions about your CO2 map, Claudia. So the first one is easy.
Okay.
What is the name of the documentary from Netflix? Maybe can you say it?
It's called Kiss the Ground. And it's,
Okay.
I can caution you that it's quite, I mean, it's from the US perspective, but France also plays a positive role. They talk a lot about the French Minister for Agriculture, and the main message is about carbon drawdown, so the ability of the soil to act as a carbon sink. And for me, one of the new messages was that soil, if it's really left undisturbed for a long time and you develop a humus layer, you can really store carbon in the soil for for over 100 years. And so I had always assumed that storing carbon in the soil was kind of like a really short-term measure, but it seems that it could really be a solution.
So I will read the 2 next questions because they both concern this map. So Frederick said CO2 reduction in summer is not only because of crops growing, but also simply for trees, grass, and other non-agricultural plants growing up. And I will just add the other question from Tommaso Tonina. Why CO2 appears to remain in the boreal hemisphere? Why it doesn't spread uniformly around the globe? So can you just comment on
that I cannot answer. Yeah. But so this whole sequence there, they show the video in this documentary was quite powerful, and yeah, I just recommend going to the NASA website. So if you Google CO2 concentrations NASA, you'll get to see a whole video on it and someone from NASA talking about it. But they didn't, to my knowledge, they didn't talk about that in particular. So it was, anyway, sorry, I cannot answer that.
Tommaso Tonina also asked, I think it was with the different size of farms, small, medium, and large. No farms have between 99 and 200 cows, so I don't know if in the classification there was a missing category between 100 and 200 cows, but maybe it's just the study that made this classification. I don't know.
Yeah, I think they wanted to have a bigger break between the groups to show the averages more clearly.
Now a question from Joy Mengen regarding animals' rights. Are extensive system much better than intensive system? Would the best to reduce greenhouse gas emission not simply be reduce meat consumption? And I will just read another question which is related to this. Frank Walter, did I understand correctly that extensive farming has higher CO2 emission per kilogram of food produced?
Yeah.
Antonino, can you comment?
Yeah, of course. I briefly mentioned during the presentation using intensive farming system, you have to confine the animals. So in terms of animal welfare, and this is worse, let's say, for the quality of life of a cow. And I do agree that the best would be to reduce to cure the meat consumption, because anyway, what we have seen is the extensive. So I answer also to the other question. The extensive system implies that you have to use more land, more deforestation, and on the other hand, it's true that you emit more CO2 per kilogram of live weight of the cow, because simply the grass causes more enteric fermentation in the stomach of the cow, so the cow then emits more methane than if they use selective feed, and so that's true. The answer, the best thing to do would be simply to consume less meat.
Yes. So I will go faster because it's already almost 6:30 and we have a lot of questions. George Schaff, will this be integrated into an educational program? It should be great. Yes, we try to do it, but we wait for FNR funding. So I'm answering this quite fast. Now, there is a question from Laura Torres. Have you seen any correlation with GDP, income, and waste? Melanie, can you take this question?
Yeah. The food waste generated at the consumer stage the amount is more important for the medium to high income countries. Then for the low GDP countries, there are also a significant amount of waste, but shared differently along the food supply chain stages. So less at the consumption stage. I hope it answers.
Okay. Sorry. There was a question again about food waste from Ana Marta Ribeiro. How is the industrial composting percentage so high? Asking because not sure how the trash is separated when we dispose it. Yeah. Melanie, can you?
Yeah. This number comes from the Plan National de la Gestion des Déchets. So I know that there are many works to improve the separation of waste, the separated collection of waste. Then maybe I should have mentioned that the share that I showed, it's related to bio-waste, so including food waste, but also some other bio-waste that are maybe more easy to separate. And for composting, if I remember well, there is 6 industrial installation in Luxembourg to treat organic waste and bio-waste. And there are also a lot of biomethanization system for municipal organic waste.
Yeah, so if you put your food waste in the conventional trash, it will not be composted?
No, it has to be separated to be composted. Yeah.
But there are composting plants where you can, I think, give your food waste and they will compost it. But it's more maybe canteens and more
it's easier, yes, probably.
Such composting, while for private, it's a bit more difficult. Okay. There is another question about food waste from Aurore Philippe Delvigne. Is there any study mentioning food losses percentage at every logistic stage of the distribution of food products, for example, rice?
I don't know any study specific to one food product, but then for some statistics along the food supply chain, yes, there are some studies, and maybe there are some specific study for specific products at the Food and Agricultural Organization from the United Nations, because they have a lot of data and studies published. Then I don't know if you have any other sources to give.
And the FAO, the statistics, I think can be great.
I think it's a good source of documentation.
Yeah. Lucia Garzaron, you said that no tillage is recommended, but coming from Argentina, where no tillage is used for a long time now, but combined with glyphosate and GMO, is it possible to grow with no tillage practices and no use glyphosate? You also mentioned that no tillage requires a higher use of herbicides. How does this affect biodiversity?
Yes, I think this is basically what what we all want to do in the future. So we want to go to no tillage systems so that we maximize soil carbon storage in the soil. But of course, we also worry about pesticide use. Here, I recommend again this documentary Kiss the Ground, because it seems like the solution is going beyond just organic production to agroecological production, or maybe you've heard of regenerative agriculture, where you basically use holistic grazing systems also. So it's not a system with no livestock, but you incorporate livestock production in your crop production. You have a much higher, greater variety in your crop rotations. So the answer is yes, it seems possible, but you are absolutely right. We are not using this kind of conventionally or regularly across the world. It's definitely a challenge to change that.
Okay, so we will go for the last questions. There is one question about the sharing of our slides. So you will receive again an email in a few days with the link to get the presentation slides. Now, the last question we have for today is, do you have data from the urban farming that has been promoted here in Luxembourg? Do we have some data?
I don't think we do, but I recommend the Center for Ecological Learning in Luxembourg, CEL, which has been quite involved in setting up urban agriculture.
There is, okay, of course, there are the guidelines that have been the national strategy for urban farming, but this is providing more a strategy, not the data. Probably they were asking for data in terms of how much production already started, maybe, but this we don't have data.
Okay.
I mean, how much food is already produced, let's say.
Yeah, it's more maybe complicated to estimate. So sorry, we could not answer all of your questions, but it was very nice that you asked so many questions. Thank you for that, and thank you for staying that long with us. So we hope that you could also fill our satisfaction survey, and that we will see you for our next event on the environmental impacts of our budget and investments. So all about money. It will be in June the 2nd. So thank you very much and have a nice evening.
Bye.